Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Greek myths. Today the theme is death and punishment. It'll be very fun.
Nice tasty theme.
Yes, tasteful. So, we have talked in past lessons about what happens in Greek mythology when you die. And we talked about how there is an underworld where souls go when they die, and it is ruled by the god Hades and his bride Persephone. Now, this underworld has multiple sections in it, some for good souls to live in relative peace after death, and other sections which are reserved for evil souls to be punished after death. And there are multiple rivers. I think there were 7 rivers that flowed through the underworld, and one of them is the river Styx. And in order to get to Hades, Hades is also the name of the underland. It's the god's name, Hades. It's also the name of the country of the dead, Hades. So in order to get to Hades, a dead soul would have to be ferried across the river Styx.
What does it mean to be ferried?
To be ferried is to be given a ride on a boat. And a ferry is often, I picture a ferry as being sort of a long, flat boat where a farrier will stand up with a stick and sort of push the ferry along. Or sometimes a ferry is pulled by animals walking on the shore. But in the case of the river Styx, the river of death, it's a man standing. I forget his name, but there is a specific guy who would meet new souls and put them on his boat if they had money to pay. If their family had buried them with a coin under their tongue, as was the tradition, then they would give that coin, the soul would give the coin to the farrier, and he would take them across the river Styx. And many people would choose to drink from one of the rivers, was the river of forgetfulness. And they would drink from that river and they would forget their moral lives. And that was considered a choice they could make. It might be easier for them to live eternally in Hades if they didn't remember their mortal lives. So if they didn't have a coin and couldn't give it to the farrier, then they would be stuck on the outskirts, on the fringes of the underworld, and never be able to come inside. So that was considered a fate worse than death.
What would happen?
They couldn't cross over into Hades
because they didn't.
They
have
couldn't
a coin.
pay for. Yeah, they couldn't get across the river Styx.
Yeah.
So anyway, one section of Hades we have talked about before is called Tartarus. And Tartarus was a deep place where punishment was carried out, sort of like hell. And it was said that Olympus, the mountain where the gods lived, was so far above the rest of the earth that if you dropped an anvil from Olympus, it would take 9 days to fall to the earth. Tartarus was so far beneath the earth that if you dropped an anvil, it would take 9 days to reach Tartarus. So that's how far down Tartarus was. And Tartarus was a place where things were confined. So for example, the Titans, who ruled before the gods overthrew them. The Titans, many of them, Kronos, one of them, and many others, are confined in Tartarus, where they are held captive and they can't come out and fight the gods. Also, particularly bad people or particularly crafty people are sent to Tartarus to be confined and punished in a way that fits their crimes. And Zeus is the one who, he's the god of judgment, and he was the one who would come up with the punishments to fit the crime. So, one story that involves death and Hades and punishment is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was the greatest of all human poets and musicians. He was the son of one of the muses. And let's see, who was his father? I'm not sure who his father was, but he was the son of a muse, and he was taught how to play by Hermes. He was taught how to play the lyre by Hermes, who invented the lyre, and so was a very good musician. And it was said that though Hermes invented the lyre, it was Orpheus who really perfected the art of playing the lyre.
And Orpheus was human?
Orpheus is human, though he's the son of a muse, so he's not fully normal like you or me, you know. But he wasn't a nymph, he wasn't a demigod, you know. Mm-hmm. He was a son of a king and a muse, so he was a prince. So he was taught by Hermes. He was also taught by Apollo. Apollo also gave him lessons. And if you listen to one of the other lessons, one of the other stories, Apollo was considered the greatest musician of the gods. And so Apollo also gave Orpheus lessons. So Orpheus' music was so beautiful that he could charm everything. Birds, beasts, rocks, nymphs, gods, all living beings, and even inanimate objects would turn and listen as Orpheus would play and sing. He could even drown out sirens who had a song of magical strength that could draw men to their death. Orpheus, could draw sirens and cause them to fall silent and listen in rapt attention.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So Orpheus fell in love with a woman named Eurydice, and he wooed her. That wasn't difficult, and they got married. And on the day of their wedding, Eurydice was sort of chased by a satyr, a faun, who wanted to rape her. And she was sort of harassed by this satyr, and as she was trying to run away from him, she accidentally stepped on a viper and got bit and died. Right there, on her wedding day. So her body was buried with a coin in its mouth, and her soul went down to Hades. And Orpheus was so heartbroken. He couldn't imagine living without Eurydice. And so he played the saddest songs, and he went up to Zeus, or he went to a temple of Zeus and the gods, and he played these songs, and he just begged for them to help him, have mercy on him. And the gods were so moved, but they couldn't do anything except recommend that he appeal to Hades himself. And they told Orpheus how to get to Hades without being dead. So Orpheus took his lyre and went to the secret opening to the river, and followed the river down, 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 down. And the entrance to Hades is guarded by a three-headed dog named Cerberus. Cerberus, not Severus.
Isn't it Cerberus or is it Severus?
Well, I've always heard of Cerberus, but it could be Cerberus. Yeah, I'm not sure. But he played music for this. This dog was vicious. It was huge and vicious. And that's why no souls could get out of Hades. And no one could get in either without being dead. But Orpheus played music for Cerberus and charmed him. And Cerberus started to weep at the sad song and let Orpheus go inside. And so he charmed his way through the land of the dead all the way up to the throne of cold Hades and pale Persephone. And as he played and sang about his love and his broken heart, all the souls wept, and even Persephone had an icy tear. And so Hades decided, and Hades' heart was warmed, especially to see his bride Persephone moved. And so he decided to give Orpheus a chance. He said he would, on his honor, send Eurydice back to the land of the living. But Orpheus would have to trust him. Orpheus would have to go back to the world, go back to Earth, and not look back to check and see if Eurydice was with him or not, but just trust that she would be there. And so that was the deal. So Orpheus thanked Hades and started to the journey, the long journey back to the surface. And he played and he sang the whole way so that Eurydice would be able to follow him. And he finally made it, and he saw the light of the land up ahead of him, and he hurried up and he jumped up out into the sun and turned around hastily. But Eurydice hadn't yet cleared the surface. And so he saw her for one brief moment, and then she was drawn back down, and he never saw her again. And he tried. He went back down. He pushed his way past Cerberus and appealed to Hades, but to no avail. He'd lost his chance. And so he went back. Hades let him leave. And he wandered the earth, singing only sad songs. And this made him less popular than he had been before. He never loved again, though it is said that he consorted with young boys, but he never loved another woman after that. And the legend goes that the end of his life came soon after that some women who were followers of Dionysus, who was the god of pleasure and wine and parties, they solicited him and wanted him to play for them happy song and to party with them. And he refused and scorned them. And they fell upon him with anger and ripped him to pieces. And well, actually, yeah, they did. At first they threw stuff at him, but no rocks or sticks were willing to hit Orpheus. So they were so enraged that they tore him to pieces. And the gods gathered up the pieces and put him in the sky as a constellation. His lyre is a constellation. And he finally was able to go in death down and join Eurydice. Though Hades was not really a communal place. It wasn't really a place of reunion. But in a way, he was able to join her in sleep and in forgetfulness. Some of the other things, the other stories of death and punishment and Tartarus, there are some famous people who had famous punishments in Tartarus. One such person is King Sisyphus. King Sisyphus was in the habit of killing people who would come to his palace for hospitality. So they'd come, like a traveler or someone would come, and he would kill them, and instead of giving them food and shelter. And this was a problem. Another offense that he did against the gods was he reported to Hera one of Zeus's infidelities. And even though it was true, Zeus had been unfaithful, it was offensive to Zeus for a mortal to stand up against him like that. It was very dishonoring to Zeus for King Sisyphus to call him out. So, when King Sisyphus died, Zeus ordered a man or a being named Thanatos to take Sisyphus down to Tartarus and chain him up there. But King Sisyphus was clever, and he made conversation with Thanatos and asked him casually how the chains worked. How did the locks work in Tartarus? He was very curious. And in the end, Sisyphus chained up Thanatos in Tartarus instead of the other way around. And then Sisyphus went back to, he wasn't out of Hades yet, he was out of Tartarus, and he went up to Persephone and asked him to please send him back to the surface so that he could scold his wife for not burying him properly. And so he went back to the surface, and once he had scolded his wife, he refused to go back to Hades. And the gods had to send Hermes to him to drag him back down to the underworld and take him to Tartarus. And so he was taken to Tartarus, and he was given a punishment of having to roll a huge boulder up a hill. And as soon as he got to the top, the boulder would always roll back on top of him and all the way down the hill. And so endlessly he had to complete this task of rolling the hill, rolling the stone. Another famous person who was, or famous punishment, was King Tantalus. King Tantalus, his crime was that when the gods, some of the gods, said that they would like to come to his house and have dinner with him, he tried to think of what he could possibly serve the gods, and he wanted to give them his best, so he took his son and killed his son and boiled him into a stew.
How horrible.
For the gods, because it was his best
he
had to offer. And the gods did not appreciate this, so it kind of backfired on him. He also stole the ambrosia of eternal life from the gods and started telling people how to make it down on the earth. So, for both of these crimes, he was sent to Tartarus when he died and was given a punishment. So his punishment was to stand forever on an island or in a confined place underneath a fruit tree with a, it was a cliff. It was like a cliff. And just beneath the edge of the island, there was water. And there was a big fruit tree there. And he was there eternally. But every time he reached up for a piece of fruit, it would recede upward, away from his reach. And every time he reached down to get a drink of water, the water would recede downward, away from his reach. So, he was tantalized by the water and the food with never, while never getting satisfaction. That was his punishment. And from that we get the word tantalize, which means to tempt someone with something they want, but to not let them have it, ever. Another person who was sent to Tartarus was King Ixion, who was king of Lapith, something like that. I think that was his kingdom, Lapith. He murdered somebody, and the relatives of the person he murdered complained to the gods and asked that Ixion never be forgiven for murder. But Zeus wasn't sure that Ixion really deserved to never be forgiven, so he invited Ixion to come up to Olympus, have dinner with him, and he'd talk to him, get to know him a little bit. And so Ixion came up to Olympus and had dinner with Zeus and Hera, and while he was having dinner, he was playing footsie with Hera under the table. And Zeus noticed this and said, "Cut it out, stop." And so...
What does it mean to play footsie?
Oh, playing footsie. So he was putting his feet on Hera's feet and touching her under the table. Sort of rubbing her leg with his foot, things like that. And very disrespectful. So Zeus put an end to that and said, "Okay, Ixion, you can stay here for the night," and gave him a room on Olympus. And Zeus wanted to test Ixion and see if he really would offend by having an affair with Hera, in Zeus's home. So Zeus created a imitation Hera out of clouds. And this girl, who was made of clouds, who looked just like Hera, was named Nephele. And so Zeus sent Nephele in to Ixion's room to offer herself to Ixion to see what he would do. And so Ixion did sleep with this person he thought was Hera, and had a child, and the child was a centaur. Very first centaur. And this centaur, his name was Centaurus. It was a Centaurus. Actually, I'm not sure if he was a centaur. But this guy, Centaurus, mated with some mares, some female horses, and that's what created the whole breed of centaurs. And centaurs are known for being lusty, and they may have the mind of a man, but they have the lower half of an animal. And centaurs are notorious for kidnapping women and raping them and acting like beasts. So, but that's where they came from. They came from Ixion and Nephele. When Zeus saw what Ixion did, he drove Ixion out of Olympus and hit him with a thunderbolt and sent Tartarus. And in Tartarus, he was punished by being tied to a flaming wheel that was spinning endlessly in Tartarus. And the only time it ever stopped spinning was when Orpheus came and played music down there, and then everything was at peace and listened for a time. But other than that, this wheel was on fire and spinning with Ixion tied to it. And this represented the driving lust that Ixion gave into during his life. Some other notes about Tartarus and about Hades. Some people, like Orpheus, were able to go and visit Hades and return alive, but not many. They weren't supposed to. Hercules went down there, and in order to capture the dog Cerberus and take him back for one of his tasks. And he was able to do that with the blessing of Hades if Hercules could take Cerberus with only his own strength, which he was able to do. And then he had to return Cerberus to Hades. Also, Odysseus visited Hades as part of his journey back to Ithaca. He was sent there by the sea witch. What was her name? Psyche? No. I can't remember her name, the sea witch. But he went down there and he spoke to the dead and learned information and was able to leave again. He only went as far as the river Styx. Also...
that was Odysseus, you said?
That was Odysseus, yeah. Also, Psyche was sent by Hera to on a mission to request some of Persephone's beauty. And Hera was hoping that Psyche would die in the process because Psyche was mortal.
Circe.
Yeah. Circe was the sea witch. Anyway, Psyche, different from Circe, Psyche was helped by... Psyche intended to kill herself in order to go down to complete the task, as Hera had hoped. But as Psyche was climbing a tower to throw herself off, the tower itself told her the secret opening to Hades, and so Psyche was able to go down there and return alive. But those are the only three that I'm aware of that were able to go to Hades and return. It wasn't very common at all. One biblical account that comes to mind when talking about death and coming back from the land of the dead. In the Old Testament, King Saul, who was the first king of Israel, at one point really needed some advice, and his chief advisor, the prophet Samuel, had died. And so King Saul went and found a witch, which was against the Jewish religion. It's not that they didn't believe in witches, it's that witches were evil, and they were not allowed to do witchcraft or to interact with witches. But King Saul really needed to talk to Samuel, who was dead. So he went and found a witch and asked her to raise up the spirit of Saul. And the witch did this. And Samuel... Oh wait, did I say raise up the spirit of Saul? Raise up the spirit of Samuel. So the witch did her thing, and the spirit of Samuel appeared. And Saul asked him for some advice. And Samuel was angry. He said, "Why have you brought me back here? Why are you still doing evil? Haven't you learned your lesson? You're gonna be punished. You're gonna fail, and you're gonna lose your kingdom. You're gonna lose your family. You're gonna die. And stop bothering me." And then he disappeared. So in the Bible, that is an account of a soul being brought back without the body, just the soul, and then disappearing back into wherever souls go. I've heard people have different opinions about this story, whether maybe it wasn't really Samuel, or maybe the witch herself was surprised and, it was not the witch who did it, but it was God, who knows. But that story is in the Bible. Of course, in the New Testament, you have several people being raised from the dead. coming back to life. Lazarus, the son of a widow, a little girl, a woman who was a good woman, and she helped the poor a lot. And when she died, everyone was sad, and she was raised back. So several people are raised back from the dead, actually in both the New and the Old Testament. But as far as I know, they never talk about what happened while they were dead. So that isn't mentioned. They don't talk about being punished or having dinner with God or anything like that while they were dead. Even Jesus, when he came back from the dead, I can't recall him talking about what it was like to be dead at all. Though we have the idea that maybe for the 3 days that Jesus was dead, he was preaching the gospel in the land of the dead. Whatever that means. So, in the Christian tradition, there's different concepts of what happens when you die, and can you come back, that sort of thing. One other Greek story of death and punishment, Prometheus was one of the Titans, and he had lots of interactions with humans that we'll talk about in a different lesson. But one of the things he did was he stole fire from the hearth of Olympus. That was something that separated gods from all other people, was that the gods were the only ones who knew how to make fire. And Prometheus stole fire and brought it down to man and taught man how to make fire. And for this and other things, Prometheus was punished by being chained to a rock and exposed to an eagle who would come, who was the eagle of Zeus. Zeus is associated with the eagle, that's his bird. So the eagle of Zeus would come every day and eat Prometheus's liver. But Prometheus is an immortal titan, so every night it would grow back, and it was like an eternal torture. But when Hercules was in the middle of his journey and needed some directions, he stopped by Prometheus and killed the eagle and set Prometheus free. So it didn't end up being an eternal punishment after all. So those are the stories of death and punishment and Tartarus that I know of. I hope you enjoyed them and they get you thinking about what happens when you die.
I have a question for you.
Yes, question.
What do you think about punishment after you die?
Oh, okay, so the question was, what do I think about punishment after you die? Well, I don't like to think about it, first of all. I think that any one model of God and justice and destiny, or the will of God for people, any one model I think is going to be kind of flat or too narrow to show the whole truth, I think. So I think it is helpful to look at multiple models to get a better idea of truth in general. That's what I think. But when it comes to death and punishment, I believe that God cares so much about redeeming the human soul so that the human soul doesn't die and doesn't have to be punished. God cares as much as possible about redeeming the human soul. So much that God is willing to do anything, whatever it takes, to redeem people. Including God is willing to die himself instead. But, that being said, people are given the chance to choose to reject God. And people are given the choice to harm themselves. God isn't going to harm, God doesn't want people to be harmed, but people are given the option of harming themselves. And I think it is possible for a person to harm themselves by doing things which are worthy of punishment and harmful to themselves and damaging to their relationship with God. And it's possible for people to do this consistently so that they become less and less human, less and less alive, less and less able to respond to God's love. And I think that looks, from the outside, that looks so negative that you could almost say the pain and the damage is a punishment for doing the wrong thing. A punishment for hardening your heart, for turning away from God, for walking away and doing things you know God does not approve of. And then you have damage in your life. You could almost, it looks like the damage is a punishment. But I personally feel that it is a consequence. That God does not want damage. That he wants life and healing and fullness of joy and peace. But that people do things which bring damage. And that is you can see that in life. And I think the principle is probably true after death also. Okay, we have another question.
Do you have any idea why God would allow people to do things so devastating that it would hurt them that badly? After all, we as parents don't allow our 2-year-olds to choose to run into the street and get hit by a car.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, why would God let people do things which are going to damage their eternal soul and cut off relationship with him and cause so much damage? Parents, earthly parents, do not allow the children that they love to do things which will put them in danger, like playing in the street or eating an electrical cord. Parents don't let their children do that. So why would God let people do bad things? The first thing that comes to mind is when your child is grown up, do you let them drive a car? Driving a car is dangerous. They could get hurt. I think it is similar. When your child is grown up, do you let them take drugs? They're an adult. You can't really stop them. If you were to stop them, if you were to take away their choice to do something dangerous, their choice to do something actually harmful possibly, if you were to take away that choice, they wouldn't really grow into the person they're supposed to be. You would keep them children forever. And that would also be damaging to them. So I think the analogy is a good one, that God is trying to, he has a hope for us to be mature and full grown and wise. And for that hope, he is willing to let us have freedom. Another question.
Do you have a thought about what we can do to avoid punishment after death?
Okay, so the question is, what can we do to not be punished when we die? First of all, I would like to introduce the word discipline. The Bible says all good parents discipline their children, and all discipline is unpleasant at the time, but it creates good character. And when we are grown up, we thank our parents for disciplining us when we are children. So I like to think of, I think it is true to think of the potential pain that you have in this life and after death potentially as consequences of behavior, natural consequences. So even destroying your own soul could be a natural consequence of your behavior. And discipline, of a loving father giving correction and boundaries to help and challenging you to be more than you are now, as opposed to punishment. That may sound like a nuance, using the words consequences and discipline instead of the word punishment, but that's the way I think. Punishment has a feeling of harm for harm's sake, because you did something bad, so I'm going to harm you. Whereas discipline is harm for the sake of good, or pain for the sake of good to come. And on this earth, discipline is good because it makes us grow into a good direction. And after death, perhaps we will be all grown up. But probably not. I don't think so. I think we will still be growing and still be creative. As God is infinite, we can keep growing forever and never reach the fullness of Him, perhaps. But I think the question was more, how do you avoid coming to a place where when you die, your soul is so damaged you cannot connect to God, which is the worst possible thing to happen, is to not be able to connect to God anymore. And the result of not being able or not being willing to receive God's love, the result is punishment. The result is pain and darkness and bondage and death. Not only death of your body, but death of all the goodness in you, because all the goodness comes from God. So the question is, how can we avoid that happening? And I would say, consider each choice an eternal choice. Each moment a chance to choose God's love or to turn away from God's love. And be careful and aware that every moment, every word, every action, you have a chance to choose God's love. And every time you choose God's love, you are taking a step away from punishment, a step towards forever being in communion with God's love and growing in God's love. Now, the obvious question is, how do you choose God's love? What does that look like? that will be different for you and for every different person. And all the ministers and pastors and theologians of all history have been trying to find out how to tell right from wrong and good from bad, and how to follow God's will and receive God's fellowship. So there's way more to be said about this than I can say, but I encourage you to ask that question. How do I receive God's love? How do I follow God's love? And ask the question and read what the great thinkers have said, and see what you can find. Another question.
Do you have any thoughts about reincarnation, or the ideas of other cultures like karma, this kind of thing?
Okay, so the question is, what about the ideas from other cultures about consequences and judgment and life after death, such as reincarnation and karma? I tend to not think reincarnation is very likely. But it's not something I've thought a lot about. And if it is or is not true, it wouldn't probably deeply change my core beliefs. So it's not a hill to die on for me at this moment. But I tend to think it's not likely because God is such a lover of individuals, and he died, at least my concept of God is that he loves you, who you are, not you as one of 50,000 lives on end strung out through history, but you right now, who you are, and that your purpose is to be with God forever, not to be on earth forever, not to be endlessly cycling through growing up, learning how to read, learning how to talk, learning how to walk, and considering the meaning of life over and over and over again. I think the meaning of life is to move through life to God. So intuitively, I don't really connect with the idea of reincarnation. I think that's not very likely, but whatever. Now, karma is the idea that you do good things and you get credit. You do bad things and you get debt. And if you can do more good things than bad things, then in the end you'll have sort of stock in heaven, and it'll be good for your soul, and you will get into heaven instead of having punishment for ending up with less than 0. That's sort of the idea of karma. That idea of a balance between good and bad actions is very, very common in world religions. Almost every religion has people being judged eternally based on good actions and bad actions. This is not something that's in Christianity. Christianity is very unusual in that it doesn't have this concept of karma. Christianity says that that every person, when they are born, come in with so much bad karma, no amount of good actions could ever make up for it, on top of all the bad actions they do in life. You're born into sin in the Christian concept. And that God cared about this enough to come down to earth and give his own life as payment for the bad karma of all the people of history. And because Jesus died, Jesus, who had only good karma, died. All the people of history have the chance to zero out their debt and be accepted into heaven as blameless, with no guilt. And if the only thing that you could do, which would disqualify you from this, is to opt out, to not accept the gift. But no amount of good actions could ever get you into a place of justification without accepting the gift of grace and the gift of Jesus' life in exchange for yours. So that's the Christian model for karma, and that's very unusual. I can't offhand think of any other religion that has that, not even the Jewish one. The Jewish one does have a sacrificial system, but not to this degree. You have to do the sacrifices in order to make up for your bad behaviors. It's your sacrifice, not someone else's sacrifice on your behalf. Yes?
What do you think of the experience of people who die and come back, like they have a near-death experience?
Okay, so the question was, what about near-death experiences? What about people who die and are dead for a few minutes or even an hour and then come back to life? And they say that they have had experiences, that they've seen things or done things while they were dead. There is a lot of controversy over this. I'm studied psychology, and I've read a good bit about these near-death experiences, and in some ways they are very convincing. They're pretty consistent, but and what people tend to say is that they come out of their body, they can see their body, then they see a light, and they start moving towards a light in a dark tunnel. They meet some sort of being in the light who is very loving and accepting of them. Though people say it's different things. Some say it's themselves, like a higher being. Some say it's an angel. Some say it is a woman or a man or God or Jesus. And this being is always loving and always accepting and helps them think, re-experience their life, their whole life. But this being is never judging them. They judge themselves until they realize that the being is accepting of them. And then that's about as far as most people go. Then they come back to their bodies. Sometimes they go beyond that and learn things or talk to this being and have questions answered or whatever. It's usually positive. And people who have died say usually they are not afraid of death anymore at all. And most of them say they didn't want to come back to their bodies. So it's very convincing because of how consistent it is. Though something that's surprising is there are very few negative accounts. And a lot of people who die briefly and come back don't have any experience that they remember. For a while, when I was learning about these experiences, I found them very encouraging and almost like proof that there is life after death, and this is what it is like. We know. People have done it and come back. They can tell us. More recently, I have been learning about some of the physiological, like neuroscience explanations for these experiences, and experiments that are being done to try and see if they can prove that these people have seen something during the time that they were clinically dead that is objectively happened or something. They're trying to verify these accounts, and so far I think it hasn't been clearly clinically proven that people have witnessed something while outside of their bodies that was happening or something like that. Also, they have shown through neuroscience that it would make a lot of sense for people to have this sort of experience, considering the brain chemistry that goes on when the brain is under extreme trauma. So for me, I'm not sure what's happening. I wouldn't stake my life on the stories that people tell in their near-death experiences, but they are definitely hopeful, and they definitely make, they give a presentation of death that's not scary, that is peaceful, that is accepting and acceptable for these people. Yes.
This will probably be my last question.
Last question.
What makes you think that your beliefs are right? Like, we've talked about the Greeks, we've talked about lots of world religions. I presume that you feel pretty strongly that your beliefs have some degree of validity. How do you know that? Or what makes you think, is there any evidence to tell people what to believe of all the many things that people believe?
Okay, so the question is, why do I think that my views are right or true when we've talked about what other people believe? The Greeks, karma, reincarnation, near-death experience people. Why do I think my beliefs are true? This is the question. There are two questions in my mind. What is true, and why do you think it's true? What is true, and how do you know? I'd say three things come to my mind. Actually, four. I'll give it four. One, the first thing that comes to my mind is that the people in my life that I've witnessed who subscribe to these beliefs about God, Holy Spirit, Jesus, the Bible, their lives show transformational power. People have changed from being hopeless and bad and bound to behaviors that were destructive, to being free and full of joy and full of love and full of hope. And that change gives credibility to what they are saying, because there's power in their lives. That's one thing. Another thing is, I am involved in a healing prayer ministry, and there are miracles. People pray in the name of Jesus, and things happen. Visible healings happen. Tumors disappear before your eyes. Bones rearrange.
You've personally seen this?
I have talked firsthand to people who have personally seen it, and I've seen things that are not so dramatic, but smaller. A person that I was praying with had bunions on her feet that were very painful, made it painful for her to walk, and she was always in pain. And she'd been to the doctor, and the doctor said that the only thing she could do is manage the pain and hope it didn't get worse by wearing the right kind of shoes. But there was no way to make it better without surgery. and we prayed for her, and the next week she came back and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, doing with what? And I said, with your feet, with your bunions. She said that the pain had gone away that evening after the prayer and had never come back, and she'd forgotten about them. And I talked to her a couple months later, and she said, yeah, it had nothing, it had never come back. It was just no longer a problem for her. So that is one example of something I witnessed. A woman who was also in our group was prayed for her back was curved or bent, and as she was being prayed for, her back, the bones moved in her back, and people could feel it with their hands on her back, and her pain went away and she was straight. Her back was straightened. That was in our group. I wasn't there, I wasn't present when that happened, but she told me about it herself. And we also listened to videos of people who are in prayer ministry, and they were teaching about healing, and they gave many stories of things that they had personally experienced. There's a whole community, a whole large international community of people who are involved in healing prayer ministry, and that was one of Jesus's primary ministries. And these people pray in Jesus' name, and they have very consistent experiences. It doesn't seem credible to me that it is a hoax, because it is so extensive. So that sort of thing, those miracles in Jesus' name, give credibility to Jesus and his teaching, at least in the Gospels. Also, there is a scientific way of looking at the Bible and seeing how well it holds up under scientific scrutiny, and the Bible holds up very, very well by the secular standard for historical documents and their believability and credibility. And by secular standards, the Bible is one of the most trustworthy documents in existence. So that is also gives credibility to what it says. And I trust the great minds that have studied thoroughly and challenged carefully the teachings of Christianity. And I trust the conclusions they've come to as well. C.S. Lewis is one of my he's someone that I look up to and respect and trust very deeply. He was an atheist and a brilliant mind, and studied very carefully, very thoroughly, and became a believer, and is now one of the greatest apologists, people who give a defense of their beliefs. So if you want a real defense of Christianity, read C.S. Lewis. He really he convinces me, in addition to other people and other things. And then the final reason I would give for my faith is that I experience God. And I pray in Jesus' name, and I encounter God in the Bible, and I definitely have the impression that there is a being interacting with me and enlightening my reading and responding to my prayers and providing for my needs and guiding me through pain and teaching me lessons as I grow. I definitely get that impression consistently. Though, in the end, it has to be faith. It's not ever going to be proof, probably. The miracles are pretty striking. And personal experiences, like the near-death experiences, or personal encounters with the divine, are leave an impression. But you could always say it was a hallucination, it was my imagination. There's not enough proof. You could always say that. In the end, you're going to have to choose. What are you going to believe? What are you going to give your life to? What are you going to obey? And I have chosen to believe in a loving God who is personally involved in my life and is transforming the world into something beautiful in spite of evil and deception. You're going to have to decide what you believe.
Well, that's the last question.
Well, tune in next time to learn about love. Thank you.